You are listening to Danièle's podcast. On Danièle's podcast, we dive into everything that drives the DIY scene, past and present. The music, the movement, the mindset. This interview series with Michael Murphy is inspired by his latest book, Pop Music Management: Lessons from the Managers of No1 Albums, published by Routledge. After Motown's massive success in shaping the black music industry, early hip-hop managers faced a whole new set of challenges. How did young entrepreneurs push this niche movement into the mainstream? In this episode, Michael breaks it down, how hip-hop's pioneers studied punk's DIY strategies to shock, engage, and sell, using that energy to carve out a global audience.
Hip-hop is fascinating. The business story. Now, take away the music, and I'm a huge hip-hop fan, like hip-hop. I could spend the rest of my life only listening to hip-hop, and I'd be completely satisfied. So I'm a huge fan of the music, but the business is even more fascinating. And Motown, you picked up on this idea that DIY, the threads of DIY are running through things. And Motown is DIY. You know, it's not a major label deciding, hey, we need a black division. The major labels tried that. They didn't ever equal Motown. And hip hop, the foundation of hip hop, pure DIY, pure street entrepreneurship, pure hustle. And I don't mean hustle in the way some of the hip hop business has been glamorized as, hey, they were drug dealers and that's why they were great business people. And that's so lazy. And now there's people writing for the major business magazines and newspapers, and they're talking about, you know, the street skills of hip hop entrepreneurs learned on the tough street as, you know, dealing drugs. It's like, okay, if selling drugs on the street is such a great way to learn how to be a successful entrepreneur, we should have millions of them. And that doesn't acknowledge the damage that drug dealing has done to black communities. So the glamorization of the drug dealer / entrepreneur, I think it's a bit of a myth. It really, really suits people who are coming up through the gangster rap genre. You know, gave them credibility, it gave them something to talk about, to rap about. But I think there's so much crap in that story, and dangerous, I think. But the DIY aspect of hip hop is really interesting, because who's one of the huge early fans of hip hop who brings it to a wider audience? It's your friend Malcolm McLaren. And Malcolm McLaren goes to see early hip hop performances when white people don't do that. So he's one of, if not the first English person to go up to one of the street parties in parts of New York that you don't just wander into. And I just found out recently you did a brilliant guest lecture for me. And the week before, I had a guest lecture from a guy called Faulkner O'Kellig, who was a music manager. And he told the class, I didn't know this, he told the class that Malcolm McLaren had asked him, did he want to go and see some black music with him? So we've a guy from Ireland. And I know that later Faulkner went on to, he was one of the, probably the first Irish person to see NWA play in Compton. So, you know, he's a great scholar of black music, but he was there at the start of it. So the punks really understood hip hop from the start. The Clash brought Futura, you know, doing hip hop art on tour with them. They did a single with them. Don't forget the first time that rap music gets into the chart. Now, it's not a great example of rap music at its best, but it's Rapture by Blondie. And, you know, the band mentioned hip hop street culture in there. So there's a very important link between the DIY culture of punk and the early popularization of hip hop. Now, it would have got there on its own, I imagine. It would have found a mass audience, but it's very, very important to acknowledge that cultural link, that cultural crossover. But at the start, hip hop is pure DIY. It's pure young people thinking, we want to do something for ourselves that's cool. And what's cool? Playing records we like, dancing the way we want, not paying some fancy nightclub owned by a big business person to allow us to go in and dance and to charge us lots of money for drinks. So hip hop comes from the streets. And when you see musical movements and you try and predict what's going to take off, because every day young people are doing something really cool and different and exciting and innovative that's never been done before. And most of the time, we'll never hear it. We'll never learn about it because it's just them. And then it goes. It might be a band that people found. But we know that hip hop then goes on to be one of the most consequential cultural forces of the last 100 years. It's that important. But it starts off with just young people having fun. And the first hip hop record that's a hit is a joke. It's a novelty. It's really brilliant, but is it a novelty record from a novelty genre that then it's going to shrink back and we can have disco music and we can have Motown type soul, we can have R&B, we can have, brilliant black music that has always existed. But hip hop had a tenacity, and I think that tenacity came, just like punk, from young people who had very few resources. So they really had to be very clever and very smart without those resources to make their genre survive. And the Sugar Hill Gang come along. I don't go into it too deeply in the book, but people talk about gangster rap and it's bad and it's toxic and people shouldn't be. But there were gangsters in early hip hop, and they were white. So we don't tell that story. That Sugar Hill Records, it was someone. Sylvia had been around for a while. She'd been a kind of disco star. Sylvia Robinson. She'd been in the disco in the black music world, and she heard this thing and she thought this is kind of fun, and she didn't know any authentic hip hop acts, so she put one together, and it's brilliant and it's compelling, but a lot of people just thought this is comedy. It's a comedy record. It's funny, and a couple of people in the know were very, very aware that not as other people are doing that. That there's Cool Herc, there's Africa Bambaataa, who then went on to. I don't want to make all of this about punk, but then one of his significant records is a fantastic collaboration with John Lydon. It's one of John Lydon's greatest pieces of work in a career, that spanned over 40 years and has delivered many brilliant pieces of work. But the World Destruction collaboration is a fantastic piece of music and art and culture. So a couple of people luckily were able to say hip hop is a lot more than that novelty. And that novelty was a big hit. So it could have overshadowed things. And obviously Russell Simmons is a key player in this. And when we're talking about icons of the music industry from Enterprise, we have to acknowledge the legacy of sexual exploitation, the legacy of harassment, and the very, very credible claims against a lot of the people who are in my book. But I had written a section, but it was taken out of the book because it would have made it a different book. But there needs to be a book written, many books about how women were treated in the music industry. And Russell Simmons is the right person at the right time in the right place. And he's seeing early street culture, and he becomes a key architect of hip hop. He becomes a producer. That often happens in music scenes that don't have any commercial investment early on. His brother is in Run DMC, arguably the most important of the early hip hop groups because they break out, they become commercially successful. So he's got a hip hop superstar in his house. That's a great advantage for an entrepreneur. And the interesting thing we talked previously on other episodes of your show about clusters. And I don't think of clusters of just people doing the same things. And the interesting cluster, one of the interesting clusters in hip hop, is where music overlapped with fashion. And what you wear if you're young and you're cool, you don't wear what everyone else wears. You don't wear what your parents wear. And how do you get noticed if you're a very, very small genre? One of the ways you get noticed is if you get a major corporation deciding to do a collaboration with you. And we know about Adidas. I shouldn't say we know. Some people know about Adidas deciding, hey, we should get involved with hip hop. They're not American. Where were the American companies when hip hop was growing? Where were the big names in corporate America saying, this is really cool, this is really exciting, this is really happening? If they're smart, they're thinking, yeah, we could sell a load of product from it. And they're standing back. Not for us. They either don't know about it or they don't want to be involved with it because of the reputational damage it might do if they're perceived as we're black friendly corporations. You might do that on a niche level to the black community, but that's not the signal you want to send to mainstream America. So it's a continental European company is the first major corporate alliance.
Jay-Z recognized a hard truth. Black businesses had no lasting legacy. Each generation had to start from scratch, rebuilding success over and over again. I asked Michael how Jay-Z changed the game.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Danielle. I'm Irish, so I'm very, very conscious of the fact that Ireland doesn't have an entrepreneurial history. Catholics were the majority in Ireland. Catholics didn't do business, they didn't do enterprise. So there wasn't a great history of the majority of people in Ireland doing business. So there wasn't a father or grandfather or great grandfather with large successful exporting businesses. And when I started digging around, I saw that the same was true for the black community in the States. You had the pioneer, you had Motown, and then you never had another Motown. You had the hip hop entrepreneurs who had a cluster that dovetailed with a cluster of fashion companies, FUBU, for us, by us. You had early startups. You had the beginning of streetwear, which was baggy clothes. And the baggy clothes wasn't just that it looked cool. It was that the tracksuit, the athletic wear, the leisure wear, the baggy clothes was specific because the breakdancers on the street would get burns from the fabric if they were breakdancing on a mat or from the concrete if they slipped off the mat. So they needed baggy clothes that went down sometimes to their knees. So oversized basketball shirts it became part of the hip hop fashion and the style. And Jay-Z is watching all of this. And he's seeing the entrepreneurs like Russell Simmons, who they don't just succeed in the music industry. They then go back into the fashion industry. And most hip hop acts that have multi-million selling careers have a fashion line or a tequila or a champagne or something. They've got a business that's outside of the music business, but that's fueled by their brand that is born from the music industry. And Jay-Z is the kind of the gold standard, the platinum standard of this. And, I mentioned that, again, famously, he comes from the street and he's a hustler and all of that. Yeah, but he's also incredibly intelligent. And it's one of the few mentions of France in my book where he talks about, it's well documented, that he goes, the president of France invites him for dinner. So that's where hip hop is. The president of France wants to be seen with the hip hop icons, and it doesn't get any more mainstream than that. In the book, I also talk about how Russell Simmons, yeah, I think I'm correct in saying in one of the editions of Russell Simmons' autobiography, there's only one name on the back of it, and it's Donald Trump, who said, I was really close with Donald Trump. So you see that a lot of the politics of performance comes out of the pop music, and no one was better at that than the hip hop artists. From the start, it was in their DNA because it was the DNA of a survivor, a hungry fighter. We talk about the hungry fighter archetype sometimes in immigrant entrepreneurs. And the same was true in the early hip hop sphere. And someone like Jay-Z has just shown the potential of that world. And he's not confined to the Black audience. He's not confined to the American audience. These are global, ambitious business people.
Next up, the trailblazing women who broke into the boys' club of music management. Michael takes us through their untold stories, how, like hip-hop's early managers, they used a DIY ethos and sheer determination to make their mark. Their impact was groundbreaking, their resilience unmatched. Tune in for a deep dive into the women who changed the game.